I didn't understand a word they said. Or at least that's what they believed. At 72, people tend to assume your world has grown smaller, quieter, limited to television reruns and doctor appointments, as if the years have dulled your mind instead of sharpening it. I let them believe that. I let my daughter-in-law Sophia speak freely in that lilting Spanish she thought I couldn't follow, her voice soft and sweet on the surface, but edged with something colder underneath. That afternoon, sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting thin lines across the marble countertop as I sat with my tea, hands folded, eyes lowered just enough to seem uninterested. Daniel stood by the sink, scrolling through his phone, barely listening, while Sophia leaned against the counter beside him, speaking in a low voice she thought was private. I caught fragments at first, just enough to stir something uneasy in my chest. Words like transfer, after she signs, and then clearer than the rest, she won't even know. I didn't move. I didn't look up. I simply took a slow sip of my tea, as if the conversation had nothing to do with me. Years ago, my late husband used to say that silence reveals more than questions ever could, and in that moment I understood exactly what he meant. Sophia laughed softly, a quiet, controlled sound, and Daniel responded with a distracted nod, the kind he gave when he trusted her to handle things. He always trusted her. That was the first crack, though I didn't let it show. To them I was just Margaret Collins, a widowed mother who needed help managing her affairs, someone who should be grateful her son and his wife had moved in to take care of things. And I had played that role well. I asked simple questions. I accepted vague answers. I signed papers when they told me it was necessary, trusting the way a mother is expected to trust her own child. But something in Sophia's tone that day was different. There was a certainty to it, a quiet confidence that suggested this wasn't a new conversation, but the continuation of something already in motion. I set my teacup down carefully, making sure it didn't clink against the saucer, and allowed my gaze to drift toward the window, as if I were more interested in the neatly trimmed hedges outside than the words being spoken just a few feet away. Inside, however, every sense felt sharpened, alert. I listened. I remembered. And for the first time I didn't feel confused or hurt. I felt patient. Because if there was one thing people underestimated about a woman my age, it was not her weakness. It was her ability to wait. I had learned long ago that silence has a way of stretching time, making ordinary moments feel heavier, more revealing. That evening, after their conversation drifted into safer, meaningless topics, I excused myself and went upstairs to my bedroom, closing the door with the same gentle care I had used for decades. The room still felt like mine, though lately I had begun to notice small changes. A drawer slightly out of place. Papers stacked where I did not remember leaving them. Little things that could easily be dismissed, and for a long time I had dismissed them. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the framed photograph on the nightstand, the one of my husband taken years ago at the lake house we used to visit every summer. He had always handled the finances, not because I could not, but because we trusted each other completely. When he passed, I told myself I would manage, that I would learn everything I needed to know. But grief has a way of making you accept help without question, especially when that help comes from your own child. Daniel had stepped in quickly, reassuring me that everything would be taken care of, that I did not need to worry about a thing. And I had believed him. I had signed documents when he placed them in front of me, trusting his calm voice and steady smile. Sophia had always been there too, offering explanations that sounded reasonable, practical, even kind. Looking back now, I realized how carefully those explanations had been given. Never too much detail. Never anything that might invite more questions. I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling open the top drawer where I kept my personal papers. The folders were neatly arranged, just as I liked them, but something felt off. I could not say exactly what it was, only that the order seemed too perfect, as if someone had taken the time to make sure everything looked untouched. I flipped through the documents slowly, one by one, scanning dates, signatures, account statements. Everything appeared normal, balanced, clean. And yet, that single phrase echoed in my mind with quiet persistence. She will not even know. I closed the folder and rested my hands on the desk, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers. For years, I had believed that trust was the foundation of family, that love meant never having to question the intentions of the people closest to you. But now, sitting alone in that quiet room, I began to understand something different. Trust, once misplaced, does not shatter all at once. It cracks slowly, almost politely, until one day you realize it was never as solid as you thought. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of Sophia's laughter again, light and effortless, drifting up through the house as if nothing had changed. But something had. I no longer heard it the same way. I moved back to the bed and sat down, folding my hands in my lap just as I had earlier. But this time my stillness carried a different weight. I was no longer simply listening. I was beginning to see. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, something I had done for years, and moved through my routine without sound, careful not to disturb anyone. The kitchen was still dim when I stepped inside, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only noise in the room. I made my coffee the way I always had, measuring each scoop precisely, pouring the water slowly, letting the familiar rhythm steady my thoughts. When I sat down at the table, I did not reach for the newspaper or turn on the television. I simply sat there listening. It did not take long. Sophia entered first, her footsteps light but purposeful, followed by Daniel a few minutes later. They spoke in low voices at first, ordinary things about schedules and errands, the kind of conversation that would not raise suspicion. I kept my gaze on my cup, as if I were lost in thought, giving them no reason to pause. Then, as if slipping into a different layer of conversation, Sophia switched languages again, her tone shifting ever so slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. I felt it before I even processed the words. This time I understood more. Not everything, but enough. She spoke about timing, about documents, about making sure something was completed before the end of the month. Daniel responded with short answers, hesitant at times, but never questioning her directly. I noticed how he deferred to her, how easily he accepted her lead, and something inside me tightened, not with anger but with clarity. When Sophia mentioned my name, I felt my fingers still around the cup. She said it quickly, almost casually, followed by a phrase that included the word sign. That word did not need translation. It settled into my mind with a quiet weight. I lifted the cup to my lips and took a slow sip, careful to keep my expression unchanged. After a moment I spoke, asking a simple question about the weather, something harmless, something expected. They both turned to me, their conversation stopping instantly, and I saw it then just for a second. The shift. The calculation. Sophia smiled, bright and effortless, as if nothing at all had been said. Daniel nodded, answering my question with a distracted tone, his attention already drifting back to her. It was a small moment, one that could easily be overlooked, but I held on to it. After breakfast, they left the house together, their voices fading as the front door closed behind them. I remained at the table long after the sound of the car disappeared down the street. The house felt different in their absence, not empty but exposed, as if something hidden had been left behind in the silence. I stood up slowly and walked to the sink, rinsing my cup with steady hands. Then I dried it, placed it back in its spot, and turned toward the hallway. There were questions now, clear and undeniable, but I did not rush to answer them. I moved through the house at the same measured pace, my steps quiet, my thoughts sharper than they had been in years. Whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions they had built their plans on, they were beginning to feel less certain. Because I was no longer simply observing what was happening around me. I was beginning to understand what was being done to me. By mid-morning, the house had settled into a stillness that felt almost intentional, as if it were waiting for me to notice what had always been there. I walked slowly through each room, not searching in the way someone might when they expect to find something obvious, but observing, letting my eyes rest on details I had overlooked before. The living room was exactly as Sophia liked it, everything arranged with a kind of careful perfection that left no room for disorder, or perhaps no room for truth. I paused by the bookshelf, running my fingers lightly along the spines, remembering how it used to look when my husband was alive, when things were not curated but lived in. There had been a warmth back then, something unpolished but real. Now everything felt managed, controlled. I moved toward the small office at the end of the hallway, a room that had once been mine but had gradually become a shared space after Daniel insisted it would be easier if they helped organize my paperwork. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to suggest it had not been fully closed. I stepped inside and stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the softer light. The desk was clear, almost too clear, and the filing cabinet beside it was locked, something I did not remember being necessary before. I opened the top drawer of the desk and found nothing out of place, just pens, a notepad, a few envelopes. Ordinary things. But it was the absence of anything personal that caught my attention. No handwritten notes. No reminders in my own handwriting. It was as if my presence had been quietly edited out of the space. I closed the drawer and turned slightly, my gaze settling on the cabinet. I knew I did not have the key. That much was obvious. What struck me was not that it was locked, but that I had never thought to question why. I stood there, considering, not frustrated, not upset, but aware. The kind of awareness that comes slowly like light creeping into a dark room. After a moment, I stepped back and left the office, closing the door just as I had found it. There was no need to force anything. Not yet. As I walked back toward the kitchen, I heard a soft sound behind me, the faint creak of a floorboard, and turned to see Elena standing near the hallway entrance. She looked as though she had been there for a while, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable but not indifferent. We had spoken many times before, always politely, always briefly, but there was something different in the way she met my eyes now. It was not hesitation. It was intention. She stepped forward slightly, lowering her voice even though the house was empty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something simple, something that did not need explanation. She said that there were things I should know. I did not respond right away. I simply held her gaze steady and calm, the same way I had held everything else. Because by then, I understood that whatever she was about to tell me would not surprise me. It would only confirm what I had already begun to see. Elena did not rush her words, and that alone told me more than anything she could have said. People who carry unimportant information tend to speak quickly, eager to release it, but she stood there with a quiet patience, as if she understood the weight of what she was about to share. I gestured gently toward the kitchen, and we moved there without another word. The soft sound of our footsteps the only interruption in the stillness of the house. I took my usual seat at the table, folding my hands in front of me, while she remained standing for a moment before finally sitting across from me. Her eyes did not wander. They stayed fixed on mine, steady and certain. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that made each word feel deliberate. She told me that she had not intended to listen at first, that it had simply happened over time, small moments when conversations were left unfinished, doors not fully closed, voices carried through the house when they believed no one else was paying attention. She said she understood their language, all of it, and that what she had heard had not been accidental or harmless. I did not interrupt her. I did not ask questions. I simply listened the way I had learned to listen over the past few days, allowing the truth to come to me without resistance. She spoke of documents, of signatures, of plans that were already in place. She said that there had been discussions about transferring ownership, about restructuring accounts, about making sure everything was finalized before I had the chance to understand what was happening. At the mention of my name, she paused briefly, as if giving me space to react, but I did not. I kept my expression unchanged, my breathing steady, my posture still. Inside, however, each word settled into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. There was no confusion anymore. No possibility of misunderstanding. What I had sensed, what I had begun to piece together, was now complete. She told me that Daniel did not fully grasp the extent of it, that he trusted Sophia to handle the details, that he believed everything was being done for the sake of efficiency, for my benefit. That detail did not surprise me. It fit too well with the man I had raised, the man who preferred comfort over confrontation, who had always leaned on others to manage what felt complicated. Sophia, on the other hand, understood everything. According to Elena, she had been careful, precise, always choosing her words with intention, always making sure that nothing could be traced back to a clear act of deception. It was not reckless. It was planned. I lowered my gaze briefly, not out of weakness, but to give myself a moment to absorb what had been confirmed. The table beneath my hands felt solid, grounding, real. When I looked up again, Elena was still watching me, waiting for a response she did not demand. I gave her a small nod, nothing dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that I had heard her, that I understood. Because in that moment there was nothing left to ask. The truth had already been given, quietly, carefully, and without any need for persuasion. And as I sat there, in the same kitchen where I had spent years believing in the strength of my family, I realized that what mattered now was not what they had done. It was what I would choose to do next. After Elena finished speaking, the silence between us did not feel empty. It felt settled, as if something long unspoken had finally found its place. I thanked her, not with grand words, but with a simple nod and a quiet acknowledgement that carried more meaning than anything else I could have said. She understood. She stood, smoothed her hands over her apron, and returned to her work without looking back, leaving me alone with a truth that no longer felt distant or abstract. I remained at the table for a while, my hands resting lightly against the surface, my thoughts moving not in chaos but in order. For the first time since my husband passed, I did not feel uncertain. I felt clear. The kind of clarity that does not rush you but steadies you. I stood and walked back toward the office, the same measured pace, the same quiet steps, but this time with purpose. The door opened easily beneath my hand, and I stepped inside again, letting my eyes take in every detail with a sharper awareness. The locked cabinet stood exactly where it had before, unchanged, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it contained. I did not try to open it. Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention to the desk, to the small things that had once seemed insignificant. A receipt partially tucked beneath a folder. Pen that was not mine. A faint indentation on a sheet of paper where something had been written and removed. Each detail was small, but together they formed a pattern, one that spoke quietly but clearly. I reached for my phone, something I rarely relied on for anything beyond calls, and sat down at the desk. My fingers moved slowly at first, then with more certainty as I searched through old messages, emails, anything that might have passed unnoticed before. There were confirmations I did not remember seeing, notices about account updates, documents sent for review that I had never personally opened. It was all there, carefully arranged to appear routine, ordinary. But now I saw it differently. I was not looking for proof of betrayal anymore. I already had that. What I needed was understanding, structure, a way to see the full shape of what had been built around me without my knowledge. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my gaze lifting from the screen to the window across the room. The afternoon light had shifted, softer now, casting longer shadows across the floor. Time had passed, but not in a way that felt lost. If anything, it felt reclaimed. I closed my phone and placed it carefully on the desk, my movements slow, deliberate. There was no urgency in what I was doing, and that was intentional. Rushed decisions come from fear, and I no longer felt afraid. What I felt was something quieter, something steadier. I stood and adjusted the chair before stepping back into the hallway, closing the office door behind me once more. The house remained silent, unchanged on the surface, but I no longer saw it the same way. Every room held meaning now. Every detail carried weight. And as I walked back toward the kitchen, I realized that the next step would not be loud or sudden. It would be precise. Because whatever they had planned, whatever they believed I would never understand, they had made one mistake. They had given me time. And time, when used correctly, does not weaken you. Prepares you. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I made a call without telling anyone. I sat in the same chair by the window where I used to read in the late afternoons, the sunlight stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines, and I dialed a number I had not needed in years. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, steady and professional, unchanged despite the time that had passed. I introduced myself simply, without urgency, and there was a brief pause on the other end before recognition settled in. My husband had trusted him once, and that was enough for me. I did not explain everything. Not yet. I only asked for a meeting, something discreet, something soon. He agreed without hesitation. When I ended the call, I placed the phone beside me and sat still for a moment, letting the decision settle. It did not feel dramatic. It felt necessary. The rest of the afternoon unfolded as it always did. I prepared dinner. I set the table with the same care I had always given, aligning the plates, placing the silverware just so, maintaining a routine that no one would question. When Daniel and Sophia returned home, their presence filled the house again, bringing with it the same carefully constructed normalcy. Sophia greeted me warmly, her smile practiced and effortless, while Daniel kissed my cheek and asked about my day in a tone that suggested he expected a simple answer. I gave him one. Nothing more. We sat down to eat, the three of us, the quiet clink of utensils against plates the only sound for a while. Then the conversation began, light at first, drifting from small topics to practical matters, and eventually, as I had come to expect, toward the subject they had been circling for days. Sophia spoke about paperwork, about finalizing details, about making things easier for everyone involved. Her words were smooth, measured, each sentence carefully constructed to sound helpful, reasonable. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, but always deferring back to her. I listened. I nodded when appropriate. I asked one or two questions, nothing too direct, nothing that would disrupt the rhythm they had established. And when Sophia placed a document in front of me, sliding it across the table with a gentle motion, I did not hesitate. I looked at it briefly, just long enough to appear engaged, then picked up the pen beside it. There was a moment, small but noticeable, when both of them seemed to lean in slightly, their attention sharpening. I signed my name with steady handwriting, the same way I had signed countless documents before, and placed the pen back down exactly where I had found it. Sophia smiled, a little too quickly this time, and Daniel exhaled in a way that suggested relief more than anything else. I returned the smile, soft and polite, and lifted my glass of water as if nothing of importance had just occurred. Inside, however, I was not reacting to what had happened in that moment. I was already thinking ahead, because what they believed was that everything had gone according to their plan. What they did not know was that I had already begun to create my own. The next morning I left the house earlier than usual, long before Sophia had a chance to begin her carefully timed routines and before Daniel could ask where I was going in that casual tone that carried more assumption than curiosity. The air outside was cool, the kind that made you breathe a little deeper, and for a moment I stood by the front steps, taking it in as if I were stepping into something new rather than continuing something already set in motion. The drive was quiet, familiar roads passing by without much thought, until I reached the small office building where my husband had once handled matters I had never needed to question. Inside, everything felt the same. Calm, orderly, predictable. The man who greeted me did not waste time on pleasantries. He listened, really listened, in a way that felt different from the conversations I had grown used to at home. I explained only what was necessary, presenting the documents I had reviewed, the signatures I had given, and the concerns that had taken shape over the past few days. He did not interrupt. He simply nodded, occasionally asking for clarification, his questions precise and measured. When I finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful but not surprised. He had seen situations like this before, he told me, though he chose his words carefully, avoiding anything that might sound like judgment. He explained what the documents meant, not in vague reassurances, but in clear terms that left no room for misunderstanding. Transfers, authorizations, permissions that, once given, allowed control to shift quietly, almost invisibly. I listened without reacting, my hands resting in my lap, my posture steady. When he finished, I asked one question. Not whether it could be undone, but how it could be stopped. That seemed to change something in his expression, a subtle shift that suggested he understood exactly what I intended. He outlined the steps calmly, each one simple on its own, but together forming something far more decisive. There were documents I would need to sign, but these were different. Protective. Corrective. There were accounts that could be frozen, permissions that could be revoked, and most importantly, there was a record being created, one that would not rely on trust or assumption, but on documented fact. I reviewed everything carefully this time, taking the time I had not taken before, reading each line, understanding each term. When I signed, my hand did not hesitate. It felt steady, certain, as if it finally belonged to me again. By the time I left the office, the morning had shifted into early afternoon, the sunlight stronger now, clearer. I returned home at the same measured pace, parking in the driveway as if nothing had changed, as if the day had unfolded like any other. Inside, the house greeted me with the same quiet familiarity, but I no longer felt like a passive presence within it. I moved through the rooms calmly, placing my purse down, straightening a chair, maintaining the appearance of routine, because on the surface nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, something had been set in place, something precise and irreversible. And for the first time since I began to understand what had been happening around me, I did not feel like I was waiting anymore. I felt ready. That evening I set the table the same way I always had, placing each plate with care, aligning the silverware, pouring water into each glass until it caught the light just right. There was something almost comforting about the routine, the familiarity of it, even as everything beneath it had shifted. When Daniel and Sophia walked in, their energy felt lighter than usual, as if a quiet confidence had settled over them. They believed things were finished. That much was clear. Sophia's smile carried a subtle ease, and Daniel moved through the room without the hesitation I had noticed before. We sat down together, the three of us, just as we had countless times, but this time I did not feel like I was part of something shared. I felt like I was watching it from a distance, observing a moment that had already begun to unravel. Dinner started with small talk, the kind that fills space without meaning. Sophia spoke about schedules, about plans for the coming weeks, her voice smooth and controlled, as if she were already arranging a future that no longer included my presence in the same way. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, unaware of the quiet certainty that had taken hold beneath the surface. I listened. I responded when necessary. I allowed the conversation to move naturally, uninterrupted. And then when there was a pause, small but present, I reached beside me and placed a folder gently on the table. The motion was simple, unhurried, but it shifted the room immediately. Sophia's eyes flickered toward it, just for a second, and Daniel straightened slightly in his chair, his attention drawn in without understanding why. I opened the folder slowly, turning it so that both of them could see, and slid a set of documents across the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sophia was the first to react, her hand moving toward the papers with a controlled calm that did not quite mask the tension in her fingers. She scanned the pages quickly at first, then more carefully, her expression tightening in ways she could not fully hide. Daniel leaned closer, confusion settling across his face as he tried to follow what he was seeing. I did not interrupt them. I did not explain. I simply watched, my hands resting quietly in front of me, my posture unchanged. After a few seconds, Daniel looked up at me, his voice uncertain as he asked what it meant. I met his gaze steadily, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. I told him that everything they had arranged had been stopped, that the permissions they believed were permanent had been revoked, and that the accounts they thought they controlled were no longer accessible in the way they expected. I spoke calmly, each word measured, leaving no room for confusion. Sophia said nothing at first. She continued looking at the documents, her composure slipping in small, almost invisible ways, the kind only someone paying close attention would notice. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more careful, as if searching for ground that was no longer there. But I did not respond to her directly. I turned my attention back to Daniel, holding his gaze just long enough for the truth to settle in. There was no need for confrontation, no need for raised voices, or explanations. Everything that needed to be said was already there, written clearly, signed deliberately. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, the motion final but not dramatic. And in that quiet moment, as the room filled with a silence they could not easily escape, I realized that I had not raised my voice once. I had not argued. I had not defended myself. I had simply understood, waited, and acted. And that had been enough.